For starters, it's important to understand the colors that I use to create this work. This is block out white, but any white will typically work. This is Mars black, I believe. Yellow ochre. You have to excuse me, I'm a little bit sick, so if you hear some raspiness in my voice, that's what's going on. Magenta, which is like a bright red. Primary yellow, which is a bright yellow. And finally, Prussian blue, which is a very dark blue. But like every other work that we've done, you have to start by priming it. Priming is going to help the paint flow more smoothly instead of painting directly on the canvas. Well, once you're done priming, start thinking about how you're going to begin this with a simple line drawing using the brush. Then you set the stage by coloring the background and the foreground. Then you start adding some color. And then you start adding some midtones. And then you finally finish with highlights. Now, when you add color for the third step there, you also have to incorporate your shadows, which are very important. Of course, you have to use your measuring techniques throughout for a work like this. If you can, it's preferable to keep your reference directly next to your work. This is going to allow you to use the site size method of measuring and keep everything a good size. Sometimes you're not able to do this, and that's okay. But for this one, I think I provided you the reference. So you should be able to do this. And you'll see right away, it helps me establish the height. And with my brush, I can measure the width, so I can quickly establish the width. Now this is a painting of a simple apple, right? I'm just using my hand to prop it up to make sure that the height is okay. But if it's a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, that's not going to be the end of the world when you're doing an apple. I've told you many times in class when you do somebody's nose, that stuff matters. You know, you don't want to make it too big or too small. Right away, I'm getting in there with the shadows. Just setting them up so I know where they're going to be. Now in class, we have talked about transparency versus opacity. And I'm using black to color the background, but the truth is that black is too opaque. So later on, do keep in mind, you'll have to go in with that Prussian blue or a very deep blue or violet to give it some depth. And that's exactly what I did. Now I don't have violet amongst the colors that I used, but I made my own by mixing blue and red. At this stage, you're just trying to block things in so then you can work on more fine details later. But this is a big part of painting, is just blocking things in like this. This video is sped up to about 4 times the normal speed. Already it's a long video, especially for you guys to sit through and watch. But just understand that it took me about 4 times longer than what you see here. It took me about an hour. And we have roughly an hour and 40 minutes in class, so 2 class periods, this should be enough. Should be enough time for you guys. Another important thing about priming the canvas is that it allows you to use that gray as an eraser to shape and reshape things. So if you just had the white of the canvas, you wouldn't be able to just paint white. You see, like right there, I'm trimming that side with a little bit of that original gray that I used to prime the canvas. And it really is a nice technique. It is, well, it's favorable to try to keep your edges very soft. You'll see that I'm not doing any harsh edges because that's going to make it look flat, especially when you're doing round objects. I believe the term is called sfumato, which is kind of like the smokiness on the edge of a line to make it look like it's going around. Now, the brush is very versatile and there's different ways that you can use the brush. I believe that some of our earlier lessons covered some of those ways. Also, you'll see here that I'm going right into it while the black hasn't quite dried underneath. This is a wet on wet technique. This is acrylic paint, so it does dry quickly, but too many of you just sit and wait and sit and wait and sit and wait. I don't know what you're waiting for. Like you're waiting for the painting to dry so you could do something. You don't necessarily have to do that. You don't have to wait. You could just paint right on top, and then by varying the thicknesses of your paint, you can, create a stronger color. But also, sorry, I forgot. Also, you need to understand that, again, the thickness of the paint really matters when you're doing this type of stuff. We've already spoken about light and the way that light reflects on different things. So you could see me incorporating some of that red into the surrounding areas because presumably that red would be there. Yellow ochre is really a lovely color. It gets along well with other colors. And this is just the start. So it's important to understand that when you're painting, you need layers and layers. So you could start with a yellow ochre and then on top of that put a primary yellow. And that gives you layers. In real life, things have layers. Also here you can see I'm cleaning the brush and I'm wiping it. I'm doing this constantly. You may not see it on camera, but it is important. Now, paint doesn't transfer all that well, so meaning to say you could just wipe the brush with a napkin and get another color. If you want a pure highlight or something like a pure white, then you should use water. But you don't need to use a lot of water. Also, in some respects, I'm using limited colors here. It's important to understand what you can do with the colors that you have. You don't want to get carried away with too many colors. Too many options is not the friend of the artist, at least when you're beginning to learn. Just like in the instructions, you can see that this is very dull, but that's kind of good. That's kind of where you want it to be. So then you can make it more vibrant. You can make it stick out in certain places. Now I did run the risk of having it look like a tomato. I guess a tomato might be brighter and the stem is a little bit different, but they are similar after all. Here I'm still cleaning up some of those edges. But then you'll notice right there, that looks very sharp. So I try to go back in and smooth it out, like soften it. In order to get that bright red, I'm actually just laying it on pretty thick. Because the red that you have there, the magenta, is actually pretty transparent. Same will be true of the primary yellow. So in order to get like a bright yellow, you can do a couple things. You can do multiple layers, or you can lay it on thick and do multiple layers. There's lots of little violets like all over the place of this reference. I think I was gonna say that I created both of these paintings. The one that you're using as a reference and now this one. But the one that you're using as a reference that was many years ago. And the lighting is a little bit off, so the shadow's coming straight down, so the lighting should be more straight from the top. I feel like I corrected that in this one, but it gives you a little bit of room for experimentation. And I encourage you to experiment a little bit, not too much. There I am wiping again. Again, this is probably the toughest thing to convey on video is the versatility of the brush and how you use it when there's paint in it, how you use it when you take some of the paint out. It can really do it can do many things. And this is something that you gain with experience. You begin to understand that the brush can do this or it can do that. But it's good to practice with just one brush in the beginning. That way you can see how versatile one brush can be. There it is, that thick painting that I was telling you about, the thick paint on the brush just to make it bright. And I'm using that here and there. Now that that's turning out like brighter, it is important to blend it now. So I will blend it, making sure that it's going into the shadow. There's a few ways you can do that. One is the zigzag blending technique by wiping your brush. And that's what I'm doing right there. And then the other is just by mixing red and that dark color and putting it in. So you see I quickly zigzagged and then I went over it. And I'm probably wiping my brush off screen there. I am also missing a bit of bounce light there. So again, that original reference, it could be better. And I think I tried to make it a little bit better. It does need to be cleaned up there a little bit on the left. And I think I'll address that later. If you don't blend that area, then it doesn't look round, right? Again, here we go with the gray, the original gray. Now it's way too bright, so I have to dim it down a bit. But you can see how well that works as an eraser of sorts. Wiping my brush. Honestly, you don't see how often I wipe my brush. I wipe it a lot. There I am softening that edge, which is important. Incorporating some of the red into the shadow, which would be there. I'm coming in with that stronger, pure yellow. Again, laying it on thick so it maintains its brightness. You gotta be careful not to spread it around too much, or else it'll create a hot mess. So a lot of painting is just controlling the paint where you want it or where it needs to be. Good general rule of thumb is a good general rule of thumb is to remember your shadows, midtones, and highlights. Shadows, midtones, and highlights, right? So even there with the yellow, it needs to blend into that pit area, right? In order to be convincing. Now I'm adding some detail. So just with the edge of the brush to create a thin line, I'm going in and kind of cutting up that yellow. As the paint dries, it tends to dull. So I'm going back in and adding that pure red to keep the brightness, which I like and I want. And so yeah, again, adding multiple layers of thick paint, but trying not to have it crash or screw up my yellow application, right? So you want to control it, you just don't want it everywhere. Now I'm going in and starting to add the highlights. It's very important to understand that the highlights for anything usually are not a pure white. And like I said before, based on the shadow here, the light should be coming directly more from the top. So I added a highlight there on the top. And you also want to layer your highlights as well. So I went with a very like dull pink first, and then I tried to add a pure white on top of that pink. I think it was too strong, so I had to dull it down a little bit. Again, speaking of the versatility of the brush, I used the back end of the brush to kind of dull it down. Though here on camera, honestly, it doesn't look too bad. Again, here it's about controlling it. You want to make sure that your highlight isn't covering an area that's too big or too small. It's all about control. And this is for the most part done. See, I have my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights. I have the intensity of red that I want. The yellow that I added is intense enough. I don't want it to be too intense. I changed the highlight to where I want it. Now, no doubt this could be better, but since the light is coming from the top, I figured the area around should be brighter, and so I made it brighter. I did try to incorporate a little bit of that pink, as I think it would be reflected in that area. And this is stepping away from the reference. My professor said we improve, we don't copy, and I was attempting to improve it here. Lastly, the last thing to do is to add the shadows, midtones, and highlights for the stem, and even such a small area. I think this is where it becomes challenging. So even small areas have shadow, midtones, and highlights. There you go, shadow. Now I'll go in with the midtone. And finally, a little highlight there. Now, this is just a technique to practice, right? Application. Still nice or beautiful, but they're not popular nowadays. Well, not as popular, but so this is just a simple lesson to reinforce the techniques you've already learned. I hope you guys learned something from this one, and I'll see you in class. Bye.